Good morning, Forefront. Thanks so much for having me. It's very cool to be in Brooklyn with you all, and it's so good to see some friends from QCF. I feel like I've gotten to know Forefront, and I'm really excited to be here. So my turn to confess my lifelong secret, and it's fitting for the city because my celebrity crush was none other than Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker with the glasses in the original Spider-Man. I still haven't seen the new one. I can't wait. So thank you for having me, Forefront. My name is Haley Warner. I use she, her pronouns. And I have been a victim of purity culture. I've been a perpetuator of purity culture. I've been a survivor of purity culture. And most recently, I've been a healer of purity culture. Now, today I come to you speaking as a cis, heterosexual, white woman, and yet the purity culture message cuts across racial, ethnic, cultural, gender, sexual, even religious identities. And I learned that in a very real way, let me tell you. Last night at my hotel, which was in Bed-Stuy, not Bed-Stewy, which a lot of people laughed at me for. I got chatting with a friend at the hotel, and she comes from China, and she asked me what I was doing in the city. I got chatting about what I was here to speak about, and it led us into a very vulnerable, real conversation about our experiences through purity culture. Well, let me tell you, I'm not going to put her on the spot, but she came with me to Forefront today. So today is the next time we have, in the time we have, it's going to be very healing for many of us, because chances are high that many of us in this room are still healing from the messages we received about our bodies, our desires, and our sexuality. I listened to Pastor Angela's talk from 2024 on bodies. I loved it, and I'm very grateful that you already reclaimed two very important truths: that the body is good and that sex is good, when consent is its cornerstone and care its faithful companion. I also had a chance to listen to Pastor Mac's talk on unlearning purity culture and moving from sex toxicity to sex positivity. So you guys are doing amazing work already here at Forefront. And I am excited in 2026 to be with you all as we continue to unlearn and heal from purity culture. So how much time do we have? Because this is deep. And I know that a talk like this can bring up a lot for us in our bodies, in our memory, in our trauma. And I just encourage you to take care of yourself, whatever you need to do this morning. I look forward to getting to know you guys more at the Kinship Cafe afterwards. And I'd love to hear your stories if it would help you to process with a fellow survivor. So I took a survey. So I pastor an inclusive, Jesus-shaped faith community in the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I took a survey of our community back in PA, and I'm curious how much of it aligns with us here in Brooklyn. I asked our community what they had learned about sex from the church, and here are a few of their responses. One person said, "I was taught it was bad, and yet sacred, and yet scary at the same time." One person said that they ended up marrying quickly because they were told to marry quickly if they had any sexual urges. One said, "God is always watching you." And one simply replied, "Sex, bad. Procreation, good." That love doesn't matter, only marriage. And one person responded saying, "The youth pastor said my future husband would thank me and that sex was beautiful within marriage." To which they replied, "Sir, I have math homework and I'm only 12. So in the time we have together today, I'm inviting us on a journey of unlearning purity culture and reconstructing a healthier, Jesus-shaped sexual ethic together. So what is purity culture? I appreciate Dr. Camden's definition in her book, Recovering from Purity Culture. She says, purity culture are the myths, the messages, and the cultural movement to persuade Christians to avoid any sexual activity prior to marriage, often using and referring to shame and fear as a tool of control. For cis women like myself, it all came down to virginity. and this was equated to be your highest quality and possession. For cis men, it was often about not lusting, and finding someone even slightly attractive was equated to lust, so it was basically repressing any sexual desire at all. And for our non-het or gender-expansive friends, well, you better fit the mold of all the cis-het people and overcome your sexuality. Now, I minister to many queer people who ended up marrying cis-het people, having children, raising them in the church, people who are mourning an entire life created falsely, largely because of the church and purity culture. It would be impossible to measure the harm that has been done by the church and conservative religious institutions when it comes to sex and sexuality. Popular culture also hasn't been helpful with its over-commodification and obsession around sex. But the difference is that the culture hasn't said these messages are from God, while the church has. And that is spiritual abuse. So a short history on purity culture for us all. After the sexual and feminist revolutions of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we watched the institution of the church become more concerned with the perpetuation and protection of itself rather than protecting the very people it claimed to minister to, especially women and children. So we watched purity culture peak in the 90s and the early 2000s, and the church reinstated its control over bodies, families, and sex. We witnessed the True Love Waits pledge cards as a movement spread globally, and over a span of 11 years, between 2.5 and 3 million young people signed purity pledges, and that's just an estimate from the data we have. We saw purity rings and abstinence-only sex education, which is still very prevalent today. And as millennials, we found ourselves conflicted and confused between a culture that told us sex was fun and exciting, and a church and religion that taught us it was bad and dangerous. The church instilled fear in parents, just as it's still doing today, and parents trusted the church. They trusted pastors. They trusted how the pastors taught the Bible, and they said, if the church or the pastor says it, then God says it. We watched purity culture directly target young people. And purity culture didn't disappear after the early 2000s. It evolved and it changed its clothes. We are living in a moment where Christian institutions and now Christian nationalist politics are in collaboration with evangelical pastors, churches, and organizations, and are deeply invested in continuing to tell people what their bodies, genders, relationships, and sexuality are supposed to or allowed to look like. So a little bit about my own story through purity culture. I find it fitting that back home in Harrisburg this morning, our community is unpacking transforming shame while we're working through this topic in Brooklyn. And this is so timely because purity culture is shame culture. I didn't start regularly attending church until I was a teenager, so most of my earliest introductions to sex and relationships came from the culture and media around me. We lost our mom when I was young, so I grew up with my dad and my 2 older brothers, and I was exposed to sex at a very young age. I had my first boyfriend when I was 9 or 10 years old, my first kiss around the same time, and I had my first sexual encounters as young as 13 or 14. I became a bit of a serial dater in high school as I sought to find love and connection in this world. And this was also the time I was introduced to evangelical Christianity. And quickly I learned that what I was doing was sinful, shameful, and wrong. I didn't want to go to hell, and I didn't want to disappoint God, so surely waiting till marriage to have sex couldn't be that bad. I was taught that having sex before marriage was the worst thing I could have done as a teenage Christian. And so from the age of 15 till about 25, I was the poster child for being a good Christian girl, at least to the outside world. At the time, I thought my identity was rooted in being a Christian, but now I look back and realize it was actually really rooted in shame. I went to all the youth conferences and led Bible studies went to Christian summer camp, and attended a Christian college, while simultaneously beating myself up in the dark for going too far with my boyfriends, or masturbating, or getting broken up with because I wanted to wait until marriage to have sex all the way. You know what I mean? I found myself in this vicious cycle of self-loathing and found my sexual desire and shame to be at the forefront of all my thoughts, my testimonies, my prayers, and my relationships. It quite literally consumed me. Heck, I even paid a medium $150. And you know what I asked him? Don't worry, he was a Christian medium. And you know what I asked him? I asked him if it was a sin to have sex before I was married. I was 22 years old. And I remember reflecting in my late 20s about all that time the church had spent telling us to stay sexually pure, and contemplating what the world would look like or be like if the church had spent all that time, energy, and money teaching young people about bringing justice to their neighbors and caring for the least of these, like Jesus did. All the while, I remember feeling like there was no one I could talk to. I didn't have my mom. Home life was a little rough. And all the mentors I had at this point were very Christian, and I didn't want them to think less of me or remove me from leadership. And then my non-Christian friends, I definitely couldn't talk to them because I was too busy trying to save them and be this perfect example of a Christian girl. Now at the age of 30, I look back and I see that I wasn't being transformed by Christ, at least not in his full self. I was being transformed by the shame of purity culture. In the midst of deconstructing and working through my own pain and anger, I also began reconstructing, thanks to those who had gone before me. The first book I read that offered me freedom and a new, healthier sexual ethic was Shameless by Nadia Bolz-Weber. At the beginning of the book, she says, "Shameless is for anyone who has felt ashamed of their sexual nature because of something someone told them in God's name." And I knew right away this book was for me. It takes a long time to break free and heal, and it's a continual journey. I am still healing 15 plus years later, but I'm at the point of my healing journey where now I'm able to help others heal, especially young people, to find a healthier starting place than I did. And I've learned that a healthy Christian community doesn't need to police people's bodies. It can teach people, and should teach people, how to listen to their bodies, practice consent, tell the truth, take responsibility, and pursue relationships that help everyone to flourish. For many of us, Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 18 to 20 were used as a weapon against us. It says, "Shun sexual immorality. Every sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against the body itself. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body." Here in these verses, Paul is addressing a very specific sexual behavior in Corinth at the time. But purity culture in the 21st century taught us to hear this passage through shame and read this as your body is dangerous and it belongs to your church, your pastor, your parents, and God. So what happens when we read a passage like this through dignity instead of shame? Well, we get to reclaim the passage and see it for what it is, Paul calling our bodies sacred, and us contemplating how we can honor those bodies by learning to listen to them, practicing consent, by leaving a relationship that is harming you. I heard you're going to be chatting about that more next week. Allowing yourself to experience pleasure without shame, embracing your gender or sexuality rather than trying to overcome them, and learning to honor that which is sacred. Because purity culture didn't just give us rules about sex, it gave us a story about ourselves. And there is a difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is the feeling that I am doing something wrong, while shame is the feeling that I am bad. And what we see over and over again is people who have been through purity culture, they skip right over guilt and move right into shame. It's always very refreshing to meet others on the journey of healing from purity culture because I know they get it. I made a new friend at a counseling booth at Harrisburg Pride. Her name is Dr. Andrea Jones. She grew up as a missionary in Papua New Guinea, among other places. And she wrote this book, Deconstructing Purity Culture to Embrace Sexual Pleasure. She says, you can take the person out of purity culture, but it's a whole lot harder to take purity culture out of the person. If we continue to feel shame when we have sexual thoughts or feelings, and our neurons repeatedly fire in our brain at the same time, then sex and shame become difficult to disconnect in our minds and our bodies. Dr. Drea unpacks how beneath the church's teaching that sex is bad is another hidden teaching, that pleasure was sinful. Women were taught that their bodies were evil, while men were taught that their minds were evil. So we need to ask ourselves, were the stories we inherited rooted in shame and control and fear, or were they rooted in love, freedom, and mutual flourishing? I don't know about you, but in my experience, a lot of the adults in my life in the church spent very little time talking about or exemplifying healthy, autonomous, mutually respectful, and flourishing sexuality and relationships. Yet the church and the culture were obsessed with sex, almost as much or maybe more than it's obsessed with hell, which is a sermon for another day. I never told you the answer that medium gave me for $150 about whether it was a sin to have sex before marriage. He was a gay, middle-aged man, and I think he really felt bad for me. He was a safe space, for sure. But maybe instead of focusing on waiting to have sex until we're married, the church and the culture should have focused on helping people wait until they are ready to have sex. Developing your own sexual ethic empowers you to own your body and your sexuality. We were told that our bodies and sex were bad and dirty and dangerous, except for in one specific context, and I'm sure you know it well. Within marriage, between a heterosexual man and woman, and this was treated like an on-off switch. We're told this thing was wrong and sinful 5 minutes ago, but now you're married and it isn't, and it's great. Well, this on-off switch has physiological impacts on our bodies and often brings with it sexual dysfunction, guilt, shame, fear, pain, disconnection in our bodies and our sexual relationships. Even if you make the cognitive shift and unlearn purity culture, your body might very well still carry physiological symptoms. I've had multiple Christian friends who waited until their wedding night and later shared with me that it was a scary, painful, awkward experience for them, and nothing like the fairy tale they were promised. They felt cheated because they waited. But what would a Jesus-shaped sexual ethic look like? While the church has emphasized purity, Jesus' life and example emphasizes mutual flourishing through consent, respect, honesty, and pleasure. Jesus consistently moves towards and had gentle and kind and compassionate interactions with those stuck and shamed, often by society or religious leaders, in their bodies and sexuality. When the men brought the woman caught in adultery to Jesus, they wanted a verdict and condemnation, but Jesus offered her dignity. Throughout history, the church has taught a sexual ethic centered on purity, while Jesus offers a sexual ethic grounded in love. As humans, we are sexual beings, and this isn't something to be ashamed or afraid of. It also isn't our whole identity, as the church and culture have taught us through purity culture. Thank you. Yeah, it's not. There's more to us. I believe we are created in the divine image and goodness of our Creator. And Dr. Drea elaborates in her book on how pleasure is our birthright as humans. Whether it is the sun shining on our face or our cat sitting in our lap, we have a right to pleasure, including sexual pleasure. So how do we navigate being sexual beings when we are single, dating, married, divorced, widowed? What if we're not interested in a serious relationship right now or in getting married ever, but we are still interested in having sex? If we were taught that we are inherently sinful, bad, our bodies are bad, sex is dirty and dangerous, except for in one specific context, well, then we've already adopted a harmful sexual ethic. It takes hard and intentional work to deconstruct and reconstruct a healthy sexual ethic for ourselves and how this relates to our faith. There is not one Christian view of sex or sexuality, and there hasn't been one taught consistently through the centuries. There are numerous Christian theologies when it comes to sex. So how do we know when one aligns with a healthy sexual ethic? We can ask questions like, does this relationship or activity honor the dignity of all people involved? Is there desire? Is there consent? Is there honesty? Mutuality? Is this pleasurable? Let's unpack consent a little more. I remember being in multiple situations where a boy would make me feel guilty. Maybe he paid for dinner or drove far to see me, and he would expect sexual access in return. In Dr. Drea's book, she unpacks how consent is more than a one-time yes. It's an ongoing yes. Purity culture has trended, and listen to me closely here, purity culture has trended in shaming consensual sexual activity while silencing non-consensual sexual activity. In a testimonial in Linda K. Klein's book, Pure, one girl was sent to therapy by her parents after they learned she had read the Harry Potter books. But after she confided to them that her brother was asking her to have sex with him, they literally brushed it off. She shares how her brother later assaults her. She goes to her parents, and they blame her. So many stories. How can the church offer healing to both those who have been hurt by the myths of purity culture and those who have done the hurting, whether you're a parent or a pastor or a friend? I believe when we create communities centered on grace and belovedness, it turns out people are pretty good at making decisions for themselves without the church having to tell them how to conduct their sex lives. Yeah. In Shameless, Nadia Bolz-Weber tells her swords to plowshare story. She invites her readers to mail in their purity rings, and she hires an artist to melt the rings down into a statue of a vulva. The rings that couldn't be melted down were pounded into the word freedom in front of the statue. This is a story of a reconstructed sexual ethic. The very things that were a symbol of control became a symbol of liberation. And God offers us a path of healing just like this out of our shame. We were wounded, and we are healing our wounds, and we are helping other people to heal. So I'm going to invite us to close our time together, flew by, with a mindfulness exercise that I hope will be healing. I invite us to ground ourselves in this space. Find your feet on the floor. Find your breath. Maybe close your eyes if you wish. We're going to go through a garden reflection inspired by Dr. Andrea Jones. I invite you to imagine yourself as a garden. As we grow up, people plant beliefs and values into our garden, and we don't have much say in these growing up. Which plants might you want to weed out of your garden? What's the garden you want to eat from? What do you wish that someone had told you? Or what garden would you like to help plant for your children or for this world? Lastly, I invite you to imagine Jesus sitting with you, the younger version of you, in your garden. And I invite you to imagine what Jesus would tell that younger version of you. As we come back to center and into this space and open our eyes, today was a pit stop on our healing journeys, which is our whole lives. It's not the beginning or the end, and I hope we will all continue to do the hard but necessary and liberating work of healing ourselves and others after years of purity culture. May we all unlearn the harm of purity culture and reconstruct a healthier, Jesus-shaped sexual ethic together. Thank you so much for having me this morning, Forefront.